Hey everyone, this is Randy Kim from the Bun Me Chronicles podcast, and I am so excited to have this guest on. She was a guest several years back. This is in 2020, which feels like a lifetime ago, and we're halfway through this decade. And Michelle Kim was on my show 5 years ago, and it was during the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor murder. She had written an op-ed about the importance of Asian American solidarity with the Black community during the protests. And Michelle was then a CEO of the company Awaken that provided DEI education for tech companies. Ever since, I've been following your journey, you have since published an award-winning book, The Wake Up. You've done many keynotes on DEI, social and racial justice. You currently have a new podcast that you host and produce called I Feel That Way Too. And in your podcast, you shared many of the challenges that you've experienced in these past few years, along with your activism in supporting Palestinian liberation and fighting against fascism. So with that said, it is great to have another conversation with you, and thank you for being on my show.
Thank you so much for having me, Randy. It's always a pleasure, and I'm really excited to be in conversation with you today.
Thank you. And so, first of all, how are you holding up this year while we have a few months left of 2025?
Yeah, I mean, like you were saying, time just feels so disorienting. In many ways, I think since 2020, I don't know that I've had a very linear relationship with time. So the fact that this year is almost over is baffling to me. I feel like I've been stuck in this loop of, talking about multiple genocides that's happening. And I think part of it is all these different crises that we've experienced kind of makes the sense of time for me very fuzzy. It just seems like it's one thing after another. So I'm doing the best that I can to stay grounded. But also there are days where I feel really exhausted and very much stewing in my own despair and disappointment in the world. And then there are days where I remain hopeful and activated to do more in the community. So it's just been a tumultuous year, to say the least.
Yeah, I think when I look back in this year so far, it feels like it's one onslaught after another. And, I've had to deal with, grief and personal loss and sometimes just trying to be present. And also, like, sometimes I still have a lot of guilt whenever I go on a trip or, spend fun time for myself as a level of self-care. But then also, like, we have these horrible things that are happening that put our community members and people abroad in jeopardy. So how do you navigate between trying to wrestle with self-care and finding abundance and joy in all of the misery that's been happening with this Trump administration and beyond that?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And it's never easy to wrap whatever I'm doing to find joy and grounding as self-care that's dissociated from what's happening in the world. And I think so often our world, our society sells self-care as something that is disparate from the tragedies and the traumas of the world. And I often try to go back to the original intention of the term self-care as used by Audre Lorde, who talked about self-care not as a self-indulgence, but as an act of self-preservation in the context of multiple systems of oppression that's operating to quite literally kill marginalized people.
Mm-hmm.
So when I think about that context, I feel more grounded in my pursuit of joy and rest, knowing that I must care for myself in a system that refuses to. And that act in and of itself is intentional and purposeful in our collective movement work for liberation, but it's not. I get it in theory, but when I'm, stepping away from the work and off my social media feed and not looking at the news and trying to care for myself in, different ways, sometimes it does feel frivolous, given how much violence there is that people are navigating. And I think that's why I have an incredible group of friends who also feel similarly, who remind me that it is still necessary that we take the time to refuel ourselves, so that we can keep the journey going.
Yeah, no, thank you for naming that because I've read Trisha Hersey's from the NAP ministry, and she shares a lot of her own wisdom, especially knowing that it's meant for the Black community that have had to wrestle with centuries of oppression, and what does it mean to fight against through rest as a resistance form. And I think about like the conversation sometimes I have with some of my close friends who are in the activism work, specifically in the pro-Palestine, and I sometimes feel like we're like yelling at each other on our phones, like, what is going on? How the freak is this happening? Or what's going on with ICE in like around my neighborhoods? And so so it is like, how do we try to like, navigate between, both like having a level of sanity so it doesn't kill us eventually, but also how do we show sensitivity and care to the people that are going through this, and knowing that this is a privilege that we are afforded right now. And I think that's something that really holds up pretty much every day in my thought. And I wonder, like, for you, like, what does it mean to be a queer Korean American woman in America right now?
I think in many ways, this time has illuminated a lot of my privileges that I'm holding, that I'm having to wrestle with how I should use those privileges. So even though I am a person of color, the fact that I am a light-skinned East Asian person shields me in many ways from these ICE raids. Even though I am an immigrant, I still hold U.S. citizenship by naturalization. And though my political advocacy work and public sort of persona puts me at more risk than other white, U.S.-born citizens, it still, when it comes to the level of threat that Black and Brown communities are facing, or Latina immigrants are facing today, or undocumented immigrants are facing, I am so far removed from that reality that I have to really remind myself that it is a responsibility that I need to be real about, to show up for these movements with the privileges that I have. And I think that, all the discourse that's happening and the conversations nationally that's happening around immigrants do have an impact on my existence every single day. And, the recent raid of the Hyundai factory, where almost 300 Korean people were deported in a raid and were completely mistreated. And more stories are coming out now where they are documenting the daily harassment and the dehumanization that they had to experience. So that one hit close to home because my dad was undocumented for a long time. And I'm yet again having to, connect the dots between all of our struggles. I think so often East Asian communities are seen as this model minority, right? That we've talked about this since 2020 and beyond. And I think this was a pivotal moment for people like my parents to really understand the immigration issues that are so often cast as an issue for Latino people or Black and Brown communities is actually our struggle too. So in some ways, I am hopeful that this tragic and horrendous violence that was committed against Korean American or Korean immigrants would be a starting place for some Korean people who have never thought about any of these social issues as their own. So I'm just reckoning with a lot of these different identity markers that I hold, what I'm seeing in my communities and the discourse that's happening nationally, and trying to place myself both as a marginalized person, but also as somebody who holds immense privileges, so that I could be a part of this movement in a really honest and way that is holding integrity.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really important point about, what does the Asian American experience mean in the Trump era, Trump 2.0. And like as a Vietnamese Cambodian person, like the Vietnamese community especially has been really dealing with trying to figure out the political divisions, which I'm sure that you're familiar with from the Korean
Yeah.
experience. And, in Orange County, the Vietnamese community is notoriously Republican for so many years, and it still holds a lot of that bastion pretty strongly. And and sometimes when I think like one Vietnamese Tet event, one older Vietnamese guy was wearing the ao dai, which is the traditional outfit with the big U.S. flag all over it, and I was like, oh gosh, and I think about like how do we have these very serious conversations? I mean, there's language barriers that unfortunately get in the way of it. The media that they consume in their native language also plays a big part of it. It makes me wonder, how are they reacting to the deportations that are happening? Like I was just reading like a Cambodian content creator who had very Trumpy vibes about him, but yet all of a sudden he started speaking out that we should not be deporting Cambodian people, which has been happening for quite a while. And so it's like, how do we get people to come to their senses, I guess, and what dialogue can we start with? Because it is baffling, and sometimes I feel like I've given up, and it's like, you know what, it's like fuck around and find out.
Yeah. I mean, it's a really sad thing to see our own communities who obviously face different experiences of marginalization and oppression siding with the powerful and the systems that actually don't protect them. I think, at least in my family and my community, it's taken a lot of time and real sort of listening and understanding of where they are coming from. And I know sometimes, meeting people where they are is it almost sounds so naive and both sidism. So I'm like cautiously approaching this subject with a lot of community organizers and circles where, it's not that we are trying to give credence to some of the beliefs that some people hold, but when it comes to especially those people who have marginalized identities and experiences and historical trauma, I think it's really important for us to bridge and try to bridge, because that's the work that is needed ahead of us. So during the George Floyd uprising, the conversations that I was having with a lot of Asian American communities and the older generation of folks, especially, was really digging into not only their anti-Blackness, but to connect them to the history of their own countries and their own ethnicity, and mirroring what they had to experience and flee to what is happening in the US. Because the fact is, many of our elders have experiences with government propaganda and repression and military oppression from their home countries. And when I started drawing those parallels with my dad, for example, it was more effective than any other conversation that I had with him, where I was kind of morally policing him on what to believe and what to say, but rather really trying to understand his fears and his need to, and his instincts to survive in this country, where it so often is sold to us and packaged to many immigrants as a privilege to be considered a model citizen, right? To be proximate to whiteness in any shape or form is preferred to our proximity to, say, Blackness and Black community. And I think it's important for us to really interrogate where those beliefs come from for our parents and for our community members, and to start to shake those beliefs in ways that will help them to open up to different perspectives.
Mm.
And knowing that whatever we are doing for the collective is actually going to be more beneficial for them than us siding with the upper class, the ruling class, and the powerful.
Yeah, I have been thinking about this a lot too, and I think you also bring a really good point here because, like, like, like with the ending of the Vietnam War, which led a lot of refugees in to the U.S. and in other places in the diaspora, and after the Korean War, and
Mm-hmm.
with the number of adoptees and also the mass migration that have happened, I also think about how the Republicans, especially, are really good at capitalizing on their trauma, and they know how to like get the buzzword, like in the Vietnamese community. The word communism is like a red flag. It just all of a sudden sends up crazy signals, and I've actually had to unlearn a lot of the things that I was taught both in the American education, but also within my own South Vietnamese community. And I know this is going to get me in a lot of hot bubble about this, but I like have had to think about the legacy of Ho Chi Minh. And in the South Vietnamese refugees, he is a four-letter word. But then, you go to Vietnam, which I did last year. It's a very different narrative, and that's also making me wonder. Ho Chi Minh was a guy who was against imperialism, and he, was a person that really wanted Vietnam unified. Whether people agree with the methods or not, that remains to be debated. But I think that also I've had to unlearn a lot of what has happened. Also, like thinking about the U.S. and South Vietnam's harm. We forget about the My Lai massacre or what happened in Korea with the massacre that happened. So I think that is something that really tells me how do we make the messaging work, because the Republicans have been capitalizing it forever.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the patterns that I talked about in the last newsletter I sent, where so often our traumas become the tools of oppression when used and co-opted and weaponized by the privileged, and that are trying to uphold the systems of oppression, right? I think that is a really common pattern that we all have to recognize, whether it is the Korean American working classes trauma around poverty and disempowerment, and using that to perpetuate anti-Blackness in the community, or it is the co-opting of misogyny and sexism in a way that makes cis people be afraid of trans people. There's a lot of weaponizing of trauma, right? Like they are in that narrative, they are weaponizing people's fear of sexual violence and their experiences and trauma of sexual violence to weaponize and to vilify trans communities, right? So I think in many ways, part of our healing work is liberation work. And this is precisely why, because when we are not in touch with our own fears, when we are not in touch with our own personal traumas and historical wounds, then it becomes really susceptible for those things to be co-opted and weaponized by the people in power who are upholding systems of oppression. And I think that's what's happening with the genocide in Palestine and the weaponization of Jewish safety and using that as the justification for committing these war crimes and genocide in Palestine by the by Israel. So I think it's happening all around us. And I think the only way that we get out of this loop is by supporting people to get in touch with their own healing needs and creating real spaces and resources for it, and also being really discerning when it comes to the policies that are being put forth that masquerades as a healing tool when it's actually a weapon that is destructing so many of our communities without us even realizing it.
And to kind of make a pivot, like over the years prior to 2023, you have led the work on DEI in the tech industry through your company, Awaken, wrote a memoir, done keynote and fireside chats at various organizations and institutions while doing a lot of the activism work on the ground during the Trump administration and specifically during COVID. What has that experience been like for you in responding to events that were happening in the wake of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor's murder, the anti-Asian violence, and how it in some ways deepened the work that you've been doing?
That was a really hectic and exhausting, traumatizing time for, I think, a lot of people, both because of the pandemic and because of all these intersecting political traumas that people were experiencing, whether it was the rise of anti-Asian hate crimes, or the, continued murders of Black bodies by the police. And I think that's when I really started to talk about my Asian American identity. Before that, I don't think I was leading any of my work with my Asian American lens, to be honest with you. But when it came to addressing the rampant rise in anti-Blackness in the Asian community, I thought that was, in many ways, one of my priorities in terms of my contribution to the movement work. So I think that time was really pivotal in me understanding my role in this movement work, and also really understanding how widespread anti-Blackness is in our community. Even though I knew that it existed, I didn't know just how deeply rooted it was in our community. So in some ways, I think I got to be a lot more authentic in the way that I talked about this work, because I was leading from a position of my own experiences and my own knowledge of what I was taught. And I think that it also solidified the importance of connecting what was happening in the world to what was happening inside companies. So prior to that time, I think I did talk about politics, but it was all in the frame of how do we make these issues relevant for the workplace. Whereas I think with the George Floyd uprising and learning from so many Black leaders, I think I became a lot bolder in talking about current events and political issues that didn't seem, quote unquote, relevant to the workplace, but talking about them and connecting them nonetheless, because they are all connected, right? It's not important just in this context of, oh, people are thinking about these political issues at work, so we need to make space for them. It was more that all of the patterns that are happening outside of the workplace exist in the workplace, and we are constantly perpetuating these different cycles of violence everywhere we are. And all of these events are connected, right? The murder of George Floyd is connected to the over-policing of Black people in the workplace. It is connected to the criminalization of Black and brown people in the workplace and on the street. So I think that was a really important time of my life where I got to clarify what I wanted to talk about, and also how I wanted to exist in this work with all of my identities.
In the last few years, we have seen the government and cultural pushback on DEI. It started with, quote me on, you can, push back on this, but I believe it was Governor Ron DeSantis from Florida. And he was obviously the head honcho in this anti-DEI movement, and also like the pushback on what is going on in Palestine and with the ICE deportations. How did it all affect the work that you were doing with Awaken?
Well, so after 2020, I started becoming really burnt out. And I was also struggling with my own personal mental health challenges. I was experiencing the worst case of depression that I had experienced during that time, and anxiety. So I actually ended up sunsetting the company. I don't know if you knew about that, but I only announced it formally this year because I think I still had a lot of issues around letting go of the thing that I knew worked, both financially and for my professional career. But it got to a point where I had to choose the work or me. And this is a classic case of me pretending to be a martyr and keep doing the work even at the expense of my own health and wellness. And that was a terrible mistake that I made and very antithetical to the work that we're all trying to do. But I sunset the company because I was so depressed and burnt out. And I started doing work on my own without a team, which was both challenging but also liberating, because when I was running the company, I had to constantly stress out about making sure that we have enough money in the bank account for payroll with all the employees that we had. But when it was just me, I could take more risk with what I wanted to say. I could really represent me and myself, which was liberating. And so I think that allowed me to be a lot more vocal when it came to my advocacy for Palestine. And, I also felt a lot of guilt around coming to this issue so late. I started speaking out for Palestine just after the October 7th incident. And that I knew that, this occupation and this historical oppression of Palestinians and their land had been going on. I just didn't think that it was an issue that I should really care about, to be frank with you. I knew my friends in college who used to be very active organizers on that front, but I just thought it wasn't an issue that I should really dedicate my time to. And so when it came to really understanding about what was going on in 2023, I felt a lot of urgency and guilt around how I should have been doing more up until that point. So my career kind of pivoted pretty quickly because I saw this issue as being one of the most important issues of our time. And so I ended up dedicating a lot of my time away from Awaken after I had sunset that business to my personal activism work.
I remembered in your new podcast, you mentioned how after October 7th, which is now 2 years ago, with the genocide happening in Palestine, you had to seriously reflect on what validation and acceptance meant for you, especially as a queer Korean American woman. Like, with being in part of an Asian family myself, and I think about the common Asian immigrant narratives, and we think about how hard we have to work to be loved by our families, to be accepted by our white peers, to subconsciously break a traumatic cycle and having to navigate in white-led spaces without guidance. And how do these experiences change or help you unlearn certain values and beliefs that you are no longer aligned with?
Yeah, oh, that's a good question. And thank you for listening to my podcast. I really appreciate that. I hope you liked it.
I did. I love it.
So this is really important I think the last couple of years for me has been an incredible couple of years of transformation and healing, but also a lot of painful work behind the scenes. And I only started really talking about it in recent months after I've had a chance to really process it. But I grew up in Korea and moved to the States and was told by many people that in order for me to succeed in this country, in order for me to make money, I need to assimilate as quickly as possible. And I'm sure this is a narrative that's very common for other children of immigrants or immigrants themselves. So when I came to the States as a teenager, I was told to adopt an English name instead of using my Korean name, Mijung. I was told I need to adopt an English name to be remembered, to have a higher likelihood of getting callbacks for interviews, which has been proven time and time again as, a true statistic, right? You're more likely to get callbacks for interviews if you have an English sounding name or American sounding name, quote unquote. I was told I need to lose my Korean accent. I needed to learn English and assimilate and dress more like a Korean American, not Korean Korean. And so I designed every part of my identity and my life to fit into the standards of whiteness. And it worked. I learned English quickly by not watching K-dramas that I loved, not listening to Korean music that I loved. And it was so ingrained in me that in order for me to succeed, I need to fit in, I need to assimilate, and I need to speak the language that people want me to speak. And that translated all the way into my professional career, even when I was doing social justice work. Even as I was running this DEI company, I was doing the best that I can to bridge social justice principles with what would be heard and accepted in the corporate arena. And I think part of it, why I was so successful in the DEI work and in my Awaken company work is because I was able to balance this criticality with the compassion and understanding in a way that was still edgy enough, but palatable enough for me to not get kicked out of these corporate arenas. And that's it's both a science and an art to say the things that I want to say without getting kicked out. So I was always doing this balancing act. But when I started talking about Palestine, I hadn't realized how that would be the single most controversial issue that would get me kicked out, no matter how I said it. And I think I had reached a point where I was done trying to play this game of how to push the envelope without getting kicked out when it came to this issue that I saw as one of the most urgent and generation defining events of our lifetime. And so when I started talking about Palestine, I pretty immediately started getting my contracts canceled that were already signed. I started being ghosted by prospects that were in the final stages of talking about our contracts. And one time I pretty directly got let go from by a client who said they are not able to work with me because I posted about Palestine on my social media. So for the first time in my life, I felt as though there was nothing I could do to prove my worthiness to these institutions that I worked so hard to be respected by. And I had to really reconcile my own sense of self and worth, irrespective of what these institutions thought of me and how they valued or didn't value me, which was actually a really hard lesson for me to internalize. Yes, theoretically, I know that I am a worthy person, regardless of what job I get, regardless of how much I get paid for my engagements. But in reality, when my bank account started, depleting itself without an income, when I used to get lots of emails about inquiries for speaking engagements and workshops, and none of that started coming again, I think I had to really sit with myself and my own sense of relevance, my own sense of self and worthiness, in a way that I had never done before. So it took a lot of, internal healing work, and also the simultaneously feeling guilt and shame for even thinking about my own loss when people were literally getting killed and murdered in Palestine, right? So there were so many emotions that I was trying to make sense of, and trying to figure out the kinds of repercussions that I was facing and how I was going to recover from them financially, given, you still need to make a living in this capitalist system. But, at the end of the day, I had the privilege of having enough savings for me to keep taking those risks and to not have to cower to the demands of these institutions that told me that I need to stop talking about Palestine if I wanted to get hired. And I don't regret that choice. And I recognize that was able to happen because of the privilege that I have.
I think that's also very important to note because I remembered, like, from my own experience, like, even though I don't have the kind of platform that you have, but I will say that I was very worried about what I was going to say. I remember my employer was like looking through my Instagram stories mysteriously, and I was like starting to put them on, starting to put my views on close friends, which also felt like it felt like I was cowarding out, and it bothered me a lot because I'm a very pretty outspoken person, and I just felt like, gosh, employers are probably going to start, blacklisting me. It's like, do I have the flexibility, the financial flexibility to continue this work? And also, like, I had, previously worked for a Jewish led organization many years ago. So there's people in my connections that I was also very concerned about. And also the other part that I've also recognized is that I didn't feel like I had the sophistication of being able to make a very good case online, because I think what I learned from 5 years ago when the George Floyd murder happened, I just remembered I was pointing out about Officer Tao among police officer who was clearly an accomplice in Floyd's murder, and a former friend who was Hmong literally was very upset at me. He felt like I was punching down on his community, which, fair enough. The Hmong community has always been invisible within the Asian American narrative, but it led into a free for all from all sides of my friends, and it took up a good day. And I was pretty traumatized from that experience because I was like, I don't want my friends getting hurt in this melee. I don't know if I have the ability to help to moderate my own content. And so I felt like I was cowarding out, taking the easy way out. I was like, and I think as time went on, it's like, I've got to try to say something. And I just, like, as a person whose family have dealt with genocide, how can I, like, be this quiet on it? And I think that is something for all of us to reckon with. So, like, how do you find the courage to be able to speak out, knowing that it will cost you substantial income, friendships, partnerships, and your own reputation? I know you had touched up on that, but I'm very curious if you can kind of expand on, like, what it took for you to feel that you're in a safe situation where you can freely speak out and join activists.
Oh my goodness. First of all, thank you for sharing some of your internal monologue, because I think you're not alone in feeling all of those things. Both the worry about the repercussions, but also the shame and the guilt for not saying more, doing more. I feel it too. I feel it all the time. And I think we all have different thresholds that we're navigating when it comes to the level of risk that we're willing to take or we're able to take on. What I constantly talk about online is how it's incumbent upon us to actually be honest about those lines and the thresholds, because I think the fact is many of us are able to take more risk than we are currently taking. And we are not able to do so because we haven't actually faced our fears and the risks and asked ourselves the conditions that we would need to be able to make those risks happen. And that goes for me too. I very clearly remember the first time I was asked to partake in a pretty risky direct action that was going to result in a mass arrest. And I was scared and I hesitated. And I also very harshly judged myself for hesitating. Like, I am one of the more privileged people in our society today. I have the class privilege of having enough savings to not have to, work without the clients coming. I have a citizenship. I am a light-skinned East Asian person. And yet I was hesitant to take action that would get me arrested or get myself placed in a situation where I could be physically assaulted by cops. And I had to really sit with myself and think about why. And I think it's a very human thing when we are not practiced in certain ways to feel fearful, whether it is the financial vulnerability, whether it is a physical vulnerability, or social vulnerability where we are fearing losing connections with one another. So we all may be susceptible to different types of fears based on our individual traumas. For me, because I grew up low income in the States, because I witnessed my dad going bankrupt twice, and I had to work ever since I was a 14-year-old. The financial vulnerability is something that I fear a lot. So when I thought about getting arrested, having a record, a criminal record on my file, and how that might impact my being able to get a job in the future, I think I was just playing out some of these worst case scenarios in my head that made me feel really small and feel like a coward. But talking about those fears with someone else, with a friend who was equally scared, is actually what got me to be more courageous. It wasn't seeing a very practiced veteran organizer who was organizing this thing, who seemed just fearless about getting arrested, getting beaten by cops, because they've been there many times. That didn't make me feel more courageous. If anything, I felt like I don't think I could be that person. I'm not that fearless. I have tons of fears. But rather it was my friend who had also never been arrested, who was talking to me the night before the action and said, I am scared too, but I want to do this with you. And me knowing that there was another person who felt exactly the same way, who shared some of my identities, and who also was trying to practice living in alignment with their values. And I just want to also preface that being a part of direct action isn't the only way that you can show your advocacy and support. And there are many, many different lanes that we can all take part in. But this in particular was an area that I always wanted to challenge myself to be a part of. And for me, being with the person who was just as scared, who was saying to me, I feel that way too, that's what helped me to feel more courageous, that we can be scared together and we can practice courage together in this way. So I think there are so many different ways that we can practice courage with each other, but I think it does start with us facing our own fears and being vulnerable enough to share what they are and being in this space together, co-witnessing the fears and vulnerabilities and the need for healing that come up, and meeting them with gentleness and compassion, and also with clarity around what our values are, and really thinking about what are the conditions I need to be able to do this. What I needed to know that there would be actual infrastructure for jail support, and that there would be lawyers who would advocate for us, that I have people and savings that could bail me out. Those were the things that I needed to know before I was able to practice courage in ways that I had never done before. So I think there are many concrete things that we can do to be able to be more courageous. And I love this quote by Mia Mingus that I always say, who talks about how we can only truly practice courage when we are afraid. So when we are afraid, I now try to practice thinking about that as an opportunity for me to be courageous, and thinking about all the ways in which that I can build my life around the kind of safety nets that I can build with my community that's not afforded to me by the systems, and choosing to time and space to create those safety nets consciously in order for me to be more free and living in alignment with my values. Because a lot of people aren't able to be courageous because they don't have the safety net, right? They don't have the community. They don't have the safety net of financial savings. They don't have the privileges of being a documented person. And so if we can be more honest about the conditions that we need to create and actually put effort towards creating those conditions so that we can take more risks that allow us to live in alignment with our values, I think we can practice courage as a collective, and that will help move the needle towards our collective liberation. And I'm very excited about talking about this because I am very close to talking about this framework around courage, because I've been studying courage for a very long time. And I've been trying to codify what it is that enables some people to be more courageous in various contexts, whether it's speaking up in their own lives, at work, or participating in direct actions, or risking arrest, or getting beat up by cops, and what enables some people to not do that. So stay tuned.
Yeah, no, this is great. And I really appreciate you just going into this deep dive and also like really modeling what courage can look like and being able to try to speak out what is it required, what do we need to get us to that level. I mean, it's not just for, Palestine, but also with, people who are protesting, because I look at Korea's protests. I mean, gosh, they're very good at protests, and
yeah. Koreans, we are very good at.
They're
protest.
very good at it, and I'm just like, gosh, it feels like the protests that we see here, and I don't do this to be dismissive of the work and the courage that it takes for people to actually show up, but I feel like, could we actually do more? How do we actually scare the bejesus out of these lawmakers and these, capitalistic demons that are just like circling around and just like clawing at us? And so it's like, what can we do to create more safety nets? And I'm really glad that you bring that up. I also think about like, celebrity culture, how it should be dying, as much as I am guilty of like my own standing of certain celebrities. I actually just decided to like cancel out Chris Martin of Coldplay because I was like, okay, this guy was playing respectability politics about Charlie Kirk. I'm like, okay, you know what? That is it. I am done. I've already had to cancel out Radiohead out of my playlist a while ago. And it's like, but I think that when we look at celebrities who are actually who are actually now speaking out, I think that really tells you that the activism in the digital spaces have been slowly working. And we saw that at the Emmys. And like, I don't want to say that we should feel bad for celebrities who are not speaking out, because I feel like there's substantial privilege, but it's also like, it also tells you the system that they are also a part of, and how they are very much just one of the many engines that run the system. I mean, you got directors, you got executives, you have so many people that can influence the media, as we saw with Paramount and CBS. And also like what other traditional media outlets, and what that looks like. So yeah, I think it's kind of like my roundabout way of saying that is that, yes, like how do we try to divest away from the traditional outlets that have actually harmed our communities, and also corporations like, whether it's Starbucks or Target. What does it look like when we have to divest too? Think about our own practices.
Yeah, I mean, I think people, this time really challenges people in thinking about what trade-offs they're willing to make in order to live in alignment with their values. And this is like a core chapter of my book that I talk about all the time, because it's the most challenging part of the work, is reckoning with the fact that because we are embedded in a capitalist white supremacist system, in order for us to build something new, in order for us to reject the oppressive patterns, sometimes it's going to require us to give up something that we don't want to. That I think most people that I have done workshops with in corporate America, in tech in particular, when I talk to executives about this idea of trade-off, they start to get really challenged by the idea, right? Because we have so long sold this idea of DEI as this rainbow and sunshine type of initiative where we're just being nice to one another, rather than an issue that requires systemic change and trade-offs to be made in order to come to fruition. We can't just hire a bunch of different people and expect equity to happen, right? Like we need to actually deliberately talk about how this is going to require us to give up on maximizing our profit at the expense of exploitation. It's going to require us to not drink our favorite Frappuccino at Starbucks in order to maintain the boycott. It's going to require us to not use certain search engines that we are so accustomed to using. We have to look at our 401k. We have to look at our, portfolio of investments that we may not have ever looked at. Because it's automated, because it's all baked into our daily lives, right? So I think there's just so many things that we have to reckon with when we start to peel back the layers of how embedded we all are in the systems, and how it requires us to be really honest about asking ourselves some of these questions when it comes to personal sacrifice and trade-off. And also reminding ourselves of what there is to gain from it. It's not just about trading off things that we want to keep, right? It's also, we're doing that in order to realize this vision, this reality of collective liberation, to live into the kind of reality where we have the safety nets that we deserve from one another, and that we can create systems that actually serve us. That's what's at stake. So when we start to ground ourselves in the ultimate vision of the future that we want to build, I think those trade-offs hopefully become a little bit easier for us to make and reckon with. And when it comes to, celebrity culture or expecting celebrities to speak out, I mean, I wish people with multiple digit millions of followers would say something about the genocide in Palestine. But in lieu of that, we can talk to each other. And, the unfortunate and disappointing thing is, like, many people are not even doing that, right? Many people are shying away from having conversations that create conflict in their own relationships. So I think at the same time we're criticizing people with big platforms, I think I'm all for pressure campaigns. And at the same time, let us also do the work that we can in our own circles of influence, so that we can create these opportunities for resilient connections and relationships. That's the foundation of the kind of community and world that we want to live in.
I want you to share more about your podcast, which is called I Feel That Way Too. And I know you've just gave us a quick introduction of how that became the genesis in creating the podcast. But what has this journey been like for you to start a podcast? And what are you hoping to see in the long run with your show?
Yeah. This is probably one of the most challenging projects that I've ever created. It took me 6 months to write my book. It took me 1.5 years to produce this podcast. Wow. So that just tells you how much effort, time, love went into this project. And I'm so grateful for my friends who helped put this project together, and Asian American Futures for making this happen. But this opportunity came about when I had lost over 90% of my income, and almost all of my speaking engagements were canceled. And, I'm a communicator. That's what I do for a living. Whether that is through my writing, through being on stage, that's what makes me feel alive and the most in alignment with my vision of my life's work. And so when all of those opportunities were taken away, this podcast almost felt like my way of creating my own stage where I get to dictate what I talk about and how I talk about it. And I didn't know if people were going to listen to it. I had no idea. I've never done a podcast before. I've only been interviewed by podcasters. I had never been on the other side. So it was such a beautiful experience of taking complete ownership of what I wanted to say without filters, but also with the kind of vulnerability I'd never really shown publicly. I mean, I went so deep into my personal life, my personal experiences, and connecting my personal healing work to our collective liberation work. And, this podcast for me is really about courage and community and being able to talk about issues that often make people feel isolated in a way that helps to create a sense of belonging and community and a practice ground for us to be able to be more courageous in our own lives and seeing that all of our experiences are not so isolated. So this podcast for me is truly me saying to my community, I feel that way too, whether it's feeling scared to speak out about something or feeling conflicted about a friendship where there is political disagreements, or whether it's about talking about your relationship to your parents that may not be perfect. And so this has been a healing journey for me, and I am so grateful that so many people who have listened to the podcast have resonated with it and are also feeling less alone as a result of it.
Yeah, I think that's incredible. And also, like, these days, how have you been in terms of being able to find the work and the income that you need to? It's kind of a hard question. I hate asking this question too because it feels very invasive, but also but because you've had to in a way make such a pivot away from these companies and partners and even friends and associates that you felt that were once aligned with you. Like, how has it been trying to find different people who are aligned with your values that help you to, be able to achieve financial flexibility so you can continue the work that you do?
Honestly, it's been a challenge. Let me be honest with you. The podcast, I mean, as you know, it's not something that you really make money off of unless you are able to get a lot of advertisements, which we have none of. I'm just fortunate that I didn't have to shell out my own money to produce it because it was funded, but I didn't see a dollar or cent for myself. But it was a project that I'm so proud and grateful to have created. I am getting a little bit more inquiries recently because I think the tide is turning where more people are realizing, oh shit, there is a genocide. And people who have been wary of hiring anyone who talked about Palestine, I think are maybe starting to turn around. I don't know. I'm not sure. I haven't recovered financially to the point where I was, how I was doing back in 2021, 2022. But I am hopeful that my advocacy and my doing the best that I can to stay true to my values that I believe have been consistent with the work that I was doing before helps me to find the right communities for me to do my work in. That's my hope. That, it may not be, I may not ever be able to go back to the kind of, income that I was making before. Who knows? But what I am hopeful is that with this new sense of alignment that I have within myself, I am able to find the people that really see my work and see me as someone who can bring, hopefully, some value to their lives. And I'm excited about that prospect of being able to work in more alignment.
That's awesome. And what do you have going on for the rest of this year and into the short-term future? I
am hoping to somehow fund next season of the
Mhm.
podcast. And I also started writing a newsletter to keep building the sense of community that I want for myself. So for anyone who's listening, you can subscribe to my newsletter. And if you want to be a financial supporter, you can, but it's open and free for everyone, regardless of whether you can donate.
Mhm.
And I am working on this new framework around courage. I think this is a really timely thing for me to be studying and talking about. And I don't have any plans to write a book yet, but it is percolating. So the next sort of era of my work, I think, is going to be around courage and community.
That is wonderful. And I can't wait to see more of your episodes. And also, I hope that people do get to tune in and also to follow you on Instagram and on LinkedIn, because I feel that there's so much wisdom and courage. And also like different, like I feel like I have learned a lot of different leaders because of your social media. Like I've learned about Dr. Kila Cadet, from
Oh,
Change
yeah.
Cadet, and
Yes.
I was like, gosh, there are so many people that I have learned from or been exposed to because of your work. And I think that is a really important platform. This is why I have such a profound respect for your work. And the last question I have is, if you had to go back in time to October 8th, 2023, what would
Mm.
you say to your past self?
Oh, I would say you are on the right track.
Mhm.
And I would say I am really proud of you for speaking your truth, even when you know it is not a popular one.
Mm, thank you so much for sharing. And
And I'll probably tell her actually to save money.
that too. I think that's always nice because,
Yeah.
inflation, we have to
Like,
deal with that. But yeah, I just want to say, thank you so much for being on my show. It is so great to reconnect with you after all these years and to really see the evolution of you and also seeing how that has continued to transform. And it's been such a treat to watch you along the way.
thank you so much for your kind words. That's really kind. I'm gonna receive that.